Many take the 8-hour workday for granted, as its existence as a structural guidepost for employers is implied at this point across our country's various industries. But, like most societal changes, it wouldn't be possible without the work of the political organizers and activist protests of the time. In the case of the 8-hour workday, the bloody events of the Haymarket Affair mark Chicago's labor history as a reminder of the cost for a structured daily routine. This is Heart of a Nation, tracking socialism in the Midwest. And this is the story of the Haymarket Affair. The Haymarket Affair has a reputation that is both well known and varied, depending on who you ask. Some refer to it as a tragedy, others as a riot, but what is known for sure is that it played a huge part in the movement for the 8-hour day. Here's Larry Spivack, president of the Illinois Labor History Society, with more.
I'm so glad to be sitting down here with you, Larry Spivack, to better understand the history of Haymarket and the 8-hour day movement. As someone who thinks about labor history in that context, how you think about the events surrounding Haymarket and the 8-hour movement.
Well, typically I would refer to Haymarket as the Haymarket Affair or the Haymarket tragedy. It is an event, it was an important historical event, hence the word affair, which also grows out of various people who've written about it, and the tragedy, of course, because it was in many ways.
Despite the nebulous nature of the semantics of the events of Haymarket, the influences at play are indicative of late 1800s Midwestern politics. With an influx of European, mostly German immigrants came a wave of anarchist and socialist policy, fueled by refuge from Bismarck's more conservative and authoritarian implementation of state socialism.
That is, of course, the best way to understand history is to understand context. The period really after the Civil War, and certainly centered in Chicago, which of course was one of the fastest growing cities in the country, if not the country or the world at that time, by the 1880s. But after the Civil War, with the railroads and beginning to get centered in Chicago as a hub, transportation, and therefore with the new industrialization going on, Chicago became a center place for both work and immigration.
The 8-hour movement became the masthead for these influences, feeding massive events throughout the 1870s and the 1880s, culminating with the events of May 4th, 1886, in Haymarket Square. A bomb thrown at police compelled the 176 present officers to open fire on the crowd and each other, leading to the death of 7 police officers, 4 workers, the imprisonment and wounding of citizens, and the eventual hanging of George Engel, Adolph Fisher, August Spies, and Albert Parsons. Parsons was a typographist working for the Chicago Times by way of Texas, and became known as the translator for the movement so full of German speakers. Spies, who arrived at the city from central Germany, worked for socialist candidates and ran for elected office the same time as Parsons during the 1870s. Engels and Fischer worked on the German socialist newspaper Arbeiter Zeitung until finding its editorial policy was too moderate, deciding with others to found The Anarchist, which produced 4 issues before the police shut it down. At the same time, Engel and Fischer were arrested, following the explosion of the Haymarket bomb. Parsons' wife, Lucy, was also quite influential as a writer and organizer of sewing workers. She'd been born a slave in Texas before moving to Chicago with Albert and helping to organize many of the events mentioned earlier. These stories mirror well the diversity of experiences of the workers who turned up in the thousands to march for better labor conditions.
Most of the industrial workforce at that point across the country was, railroads being one of the largest employers, but by 1880s, manufacturing. And so there is a interesting map. It's the Newberry Library in Chicago that has a a wealth of archives on historical information and labor history, produced a map that shows that I think it's dated April 25th, 1886, the hundreds of marches and strikes that had already been taking place in a fight for 8-hour day. By April 25th of 1886, 10,000 workers in Chicago had already won the 8-hour day, despite the date of May 1st being the day to try to achieve it. The map shows the different industries. You know, there were tailors, and there were lumber shovers, there were milliners, and clothing and textile workers, and iron workers, and carpenters. And so anything that could be made, people were organizing in small shops and big shops across the country.
As mentioned before, the political climate these individuals found themselves in had influences from many ideologies, and they knew it. What started as faith in reformist electoral politics became, with help by the violent push of local law enforcement, a call for material revolutionary strategy forged in blood. Parsons and Spies were perfect examples of this. Their leaving the electoral arena was around the same time a socialist candidate who had been duly elected to the city council in 1880 was prevented from taking his seat by election officials. The use of dynamite became idolized as an inexpensive technique against what they felt were unjust police brutalities. Police brutalities like the events of May 4th, 1885, where police captain John Bonefield encouraged the clubbing of strikers at the West Division Railway Company. Dynamite is a peacemaker, read an article in The Alarm by Parsons in April of 1885, because it makes it unsafe to wrong our fellows. Spies also took the opportunity on multiple occasions, including his sentencing, to give more context to this viewpoint. Revolutions are the effect of certain causes and conditions, Spies explained. He contended that the ruling class could not stop a movement naturally engendered by its own greed and arrogance, no matter how many police and militia it assembled, Gatling guns it purchased, or gallows it erected. Here you will tread upon a spark, but there, and behind you, and in front of you, and everywhere, flames will blaze up, Spies told his accusers. It is a subterranean fire. You cannot put it out. The ground is on fire upon which you stand. This line of thought and its subsequent frustrations with the inefficiencies of electoral reformist politics found backing within the history of bringing the 8-hour workday into law. The first time Americans thought to push against employers was back in 1835, when Philadelphia carpenters were pushing for a 10-hour workday. The first state to introduce a law supporting the 8-hour day was actually Illinois in 1867. It passed that year, but the law was not made federal until much later.
I think it's around the World War I period when finally the official 8-hour day is consecrated.
Yeah.
So, it's already, 40 years after the Haymarket Affair. But as I said, the organizing for the 8-hour day began after the Civil War. There was even federal legislation in the 1860s and 1870s that the 8-hour day should be granted to federal workers. It never was enforced. And so it's like, again, history isn't about usually one event, and it's over a span of time. And so workers were winning the 8-hour day throughout the country, and certainly, especially in Chicago, leading up to May 1st of 1886. It was uneven, and there's really no legislation until the 20th century that formulates legalization of an 8-hour day. And what does that even mean, other than ultimately you have to pay overtime after 8 hours in a workday? People always work more than 8 hours, just as they do now. So it's whether it's the period of the legalization of the consecration of the 8-hour day during World War I, or the Fair Labor Standards Act, which enforces federal legislation that's been picked apart and destroyed by corporate America since 1937. That's how, when we talk about the modern age, we think of it in terms of the few workers who are granted time and a half after 8 hours in a workday. So.
This is why, in 1884, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions, the predecessor of the American Federation of Labor, called for May 1st, 1886, to be the beginning of a nationwide movement for the 8-hour day, marked with a one-day walkout and demonstrations across the country. While this event was a great success, with hundreds of thousands of workers following the march of Parsons and others, it put a target on the backs of these same leaders for the violence to come. The Chicago Mail, from that day, May 1st, told its readers that any turmoil that lay ahead should be attributed to Parsons and Spies. Mark them for today, an editorial warned. Hold them responsible for any trouble that occurs. Make an example of them if trouble does occur. Monday, May 3rd, saw police brutality and the killing of picketing workers at McCormick Reaper plant at Western and Blue Island, provoking the meeting that became infamous the next day on May 4th. Right before the meeting's ending, 176 policemen showed up with rifles. Someone in the crowd threw dynamite. Their identity still unknown to this day, as it was confirmed that the Parsons had already left. The police, panicked, with low visibility in the night and smoke, many shot at their own men. Eventually, 7 policemen and 4 workers died. Only 1 policeman directly accountable to the bomb. The next day, martial law was declared, not just in Chicago, but throughout the nation. Anti-labor governments around the world used the Chicago incident to crush local union movements. In Chicago, labor leaders were rounded up, houses were entered without search warrants, and union newspapers were closed down. The 2-month-long trial ranks as one of the most notorious in American history. The Chicago Tribune even offered to pay money to the jury if it found the 8 men guilty. On August 20th, 1886, the jury reported its verdict of guilty, with the death penalty by hanging for 7 of the Haymarket 8, with the 8th, Neeb, serving hard labor. This would be further lessened to 4 of the 8 after further protests pushed the governor to change the sentences of Samuel Fielden and Michael Schwab. And Louis Ling committed suicide the night before the execution. Only Adolph Fisher, George Engel, Albert Parsons, and August Spies were hanged on November 11th, 1887. In June of 1893, Governor John P. Altgeld pardoned the 3 men still alive and condemned the entire judicial system that had allowed this injustice. From there, legislation didn't touch the 8-hour day until August 1916, when nearly 400,000 railway workers voted to authorize a strike if an 8-hour day was not implemented. The railroads refused to meet the workers' demands, and fearing a nationwide rail strike, Congress and President Woodrow Wilson stepped in. On September 2nd, 1916, Congress passed the Adamson Act. Signed by Wilson the following day, the law implemented a standard workday of 8 hours for railway workers across the United States. The Adamson Act was the first federal law that standardized private sector employees' work hours. From there, the Fair Labor Standards Act further provided labor protections. Many memorials have been put in place across Chicago in memory of those that died during the Haymarket riot. The most recent was commissioned by the city of Chicago in 2004. In conclusion, socialist organizing in the Midwest has further reached than we realize or give it credit for. Many workers nationally benefit from the federal decision to institute an 8-hour workday without realizing it. While the 8-hour movement existed throughout the country, it took the events of the Haymarket Affair to bring the movement to practical means.